Um, we face an interesting set of things, and so he wants us to start being on the same page definition-wise. And it was really interesting for me. I had to really think through this and say, why is he making the choices he's making as far as his definitions? Because some of them would not have been my first choice, but so I'll give you an example. When he talks about not using some of the wordings that he calls more vague. And I never thought of them as vague because they were exactly the kind of wordings that I wanted to use, right? And so he talked about how doing a racist policy was maybe better than saying systematic racism. And I like the word, the phrase systematic racism. I didn't want him to disqualify that. So I had to really think and see why it is that he was saying that and see what kind of biases I was using for that. And part of that was my education. People should understand the word systematic racism. Whether or not they do is borne out every single day as I talk to people on Facebook. They don't understand or don't want to understand that word. So what we have to do, part of his point, Ibram Kendi's point, is what do we do to make it so that we can very easily, most easily, be effective in countering the racism in our country. And the difficulty of that is that what's going to be easiest is not countering it.
It's not what?
It's not countering that racism, because it stays because it is simpler for us to let it stay. Right? Racism doesn't go away because I have no incentive to make it go away because I'm comfortable in the current space where I'm at. And so at least part of what we have to deal with here is the embracing of the uncomfortable, the choosing to step towards what would be easier to step away from. So I want you to think, maybe even this week, someplace where you had to decide to be anti-racist rather than a simpler path. Right? Where is it that this week that you were confronted with having to face some of these things? And it could be
when you start talking about definitions, I was thinking, I don't understand his definition of assimilationist.
Okay, we'll get to that then, because the first thing we're going to do is go through all of these definitions. But we'll get to that, because he does have very important ways that he chooses that, but that are sometimes outside of what we've thought of, the way we've thought before. So where is it that you think this week you've been confronted someplace where you had to go outside your comfort zone in these areas? Very, very rarely are those really huge areas. Very often, they are small areas where somebody says or does something, and you have to decide, are you in that moment going to correct, change, do something different? Randy?
Well, I didn't have an interpersonal interaction. COVID kind of limits those, but interpersonal issue. Carol and I talked to the financial advisor we use, and he was talking about, you know, what we would have to leave to our, you know, the natural objects of our bounty, you know, when we died. And I realized, you know, that's exactly what part of the problem is that systematic racism is perpetuated by cross-generational transfers of wealth among the dominant section of our society.
That's right.
I think one of the most difficult decisions that's going to have to confront everyone who's truly committed to promoting anti-racist policy is saying, I'm not going to leave money to my children who already have advantages, or, my favorite, my university, which I attended, which already has advantages, unless I specifically designate it for, scholarships for Black students.
Yeah.
Like that I'm going to have to ignore my own interests and those interests of those immediately around me for the sake of a greater good.
Good. Thank you very much. That's exactly the type of question that we have to face,
Good one.
confront. In Tuesday's class, John Everhart was talking about, as a realtor, the struggle of trying to help people figure out, do they buy into a neighborhood that is going to be more racial, right? And you can't say that but it's also going to be a neighborhood that, as a seller, you're going to be saying it's not going to appreciate as much in value as if you buy in this area. And as we're making those kinds of choices, are we doing just what's right for me? I'm going to have a better home to sell later on, or do I move to a neighborhood, much like where our Black brothers and sisters are having to decide, like in the movie The Hate U Give, do they stay in the neighborhood that's going to have issues, but that they're going to be a relatively calm and helpful force in the midst of whatever chaos is there? Do we stay in those neighborhoods, or do we check out and go to an easier white neighborhood?
I had some interesting thoughts and experiences that might be a little bit related. You can hear me, people?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, when I first started keeping asylum seekers in my house, and that was, a couple of years ago now, and one of them, and all three that have been living with me on and off, are from different, or they're all African, from different countries in Africa. One from Burundi, one from Rwanda, and the current man who's living with me is from Uganda. And I realized only after a while that I had somebody living with me that my neighborhood was pretty white. And I wondered if people were going to object to having a Black man now in their neighborhood. And so I started, worrying a little bit about it. Well, the opposite happened. People came up to me, eager to meet them. I learned about the Peace Corps background of several of my neighbors that I didn't know anything about. One in Dominican Republic, one in Tanzania, on and on like that. Another one came running up her driveway to meet my people, And so it was the opposite in many ways of what I expected. And now Richard from Uganda is with me. And so it's comfortable, and the neighbors are accepting. It's really sort of interesting. A second part of this, though, is that Dale, the one from Burundi, who has a wife and 6 kids still in Burundi, and he's been given asylum. So now his job is to bring them, but he can't because of the COVID. So, but he's really looking for a house. And the neighborhoods where he could afford a house, he's uncomfortable moving to. Mostly they're Latino, I think, but they're higher crime and so forth. And he really wants to live in my neighborhood, but he can't really afford that. But one of the places he was looking at was the mobile home community where Ed and Becky live. And I have other friends who live in that community. And the one friend, whose name is Priscilla, who's also done a lot of international work, and we welcome both Deo and MA, said, hey, there's a 4-bedroom one for sale over here, Dale. And it's, something you can afford, and it's real close to a very good school, and on. And it's not a retirement community. It's mostly Latino, actually, but it's, multi people. So he went to the owner. We got a deal going. I was helping with the money and the financing of it. And then, so that step was all done. I'd taken the money out of my savings to help him. And then he went to the manager to finalize it. and the manager came up with some stupid deed or something that he needed, which was the visa of his wife, who wasn't even in the country yet, and refused to sell it to him. And we know it was because he was Black. We know that, but he came up with some excuse. And so it was just horrible. So he's not had success yet in finding a place where he can afford and have his whole family live.
Yeah. But much of the difficulty is trying to negotiate those places where people have figured out how to step around.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So much of his language is trying to help us to do that. So here's what he calls a racist. It was right at the beginning of chapter 1. It said, one or person who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inactions, or expressing a racist idea. And then he goes on to define some of these things. So you need to know what racist policy is for him. It is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups. So these are stuff that somebody has enacted into something, and not just law at the state or at the city level. It could also be a policy in your mobile home park that says something. It could be some policy of your neighborhood association that somehow makes it more challenging for people of race, of color. And how is it that we both recognize and do something about those types of policies? But then it goes on and talks about racist ideas too. So let me tell you what a racist idea is. Any idea that suggests one racial group is inferior or superior to another group in any way. Now here's what's really important about that definition. How many know that there are people of color that are inferior or superior to you in some way or another? Like somebody might be smarter, or somebody might be faster, or somebody might be slower, right? It's not saying that people can't be, it's that the group is or is not. So we could do it in this type of thing. All Blacks are better at basketball. That's a racist statement and a racist idea. Okay, that's where we have to be careful, because there are a lot of Black people that are marvelous at basketball, right? But the idea that all are, or that all are not, that's where we start getting into trouble. And so it's those policies and those ideas that we have to start fighting against. And when we don't, any way that we don't fight that we just manifest that policy through our behavior, that's racial discrimination. Whenever we just allow the policy to be true, whenever we just allow the idea to continue. And if we want to be truly anti-racist, we have to start working at recognizing, first of all, and doing something about it. And I think that second part, doing something about it, is almost as hard as the recognizing. We don't recognize it because we don't have to. But we don't do something about it because that's hard work. Because chances are the person beside us that is perpetuating that idea doesn't want you to recognize or do anything about it. In your case, for example, Kay, the owner of that mobile home, or the lot, was happy to make it hard for our friend to be able to do that. Was happy to
No, the owner wanted to sell it. He had an agreement with the owner. It was the manager of the whole facility that turned around and said no, on a reason that we know was illegal. It wasn't a true reason.
Yeah, and the
because the owner was delighted to sell it.
Yeah, and the difficulty is trying to figure out how to do something about that? How is it that you adjust that racist policy that that owner, that manager had in order to change it somehow? And it's difficult because we've learned how to hide all that stuff really well because we're not racist.
I still have major trouble figuring out how to solve it in the educational system, such as medical school, where of course I went, and knowing that using all of these testing does discriminate because of the inadequate background schooling of many of the different races. And I just don't know how to solve that. And I mean, yes, we need to improve the school systems across the board, but it doesn't solve it tomorrow or today.
It does.
That's a long-term solution,
Yes.
and we're not doing a good job at that.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the short-term solution to some of these are. I know I should be an activist in it, but I don't know how to solve it.
But you've hit one of the key issues. And it's key in a couple of different ways. First of all, long-term versus short-term is very important. We want to magic wand all this. We want to say, ding, everyone's fixed. And that is not going to happen. It is long-term solutions that have to come out. We have to change 400 years worth of habits and patterns and laws that have built up. And it will take a while to do all that. So we have to have patience to be able to do that. But here's the other side of it. In the midst of needing that long-term solution, it's really easy to be able to say, I can't do anything. It's bigger than me. But long-term things take short, small answers to begin to fix them, right? And so it's somehow talking to that manager and saying that is not acceptable. And it's hard to figure out how to say that because we have very often taught ourselves how to fight against being called a racist. So here's what Ibram Kendi is trying to tell us in this. Why he's trying to say, don't use the terms systematic racism. Because we've taught ourselves way too well to say, oh, it's not that. And for sure, even if it was, it's not manifesting in me. But we can maybe make some inroads if we begin to say something like this. Here is a policy that has racist implications in this moment. This particular policy is making it so that this particular person, my friend, is not able to buy this mobile home. We need to change that policy. And see, so you're not saying, Mr. Manager, you are racist, even though it sure appears he is, right? You are saying, here is a policy that needs to change. And it begins to dismantle the big question. It's a very small dismantling, but it begins to say to one person in one situation that this is not acceptable. But it takes some courage and persistence to be able to do that. Not attacking, right? When you said systematic racism, you sometimes send them right into the defensive. In this, you're trying to say this policy is hurting a particular person. How are you going to fix it? Yes, Randy.
Well, I would recommend to Kay and her Ugandan friend that they contact the Arizona Attorney General. They have a civil rights division which enforces anti-discrimination laws regarding housing, and get them to work on it. We have institutions, offices that are meant to deal with precisely this sort of thing. And I think a call to them would probably work. I just pulled up their website on my wife's phone here as we sit here, and I'm sure she can locate it too.
Yeah, and it's exactly that type of thing. Every time we can, when we run into a case like this, and I don't want to make this all about how Kay how Kay needs to do something, because each one of us is going to run against something like this. What do we do to take the challenging route, right? That maybe won't solve my issue, but does solve it for this friend of mine. Maybe, you know, maybe it's not something that stands in my way, but it does stand in our way. Does that make sense? But it means we have to be very aware to recognize, and then we have to be very brave in and persistent in dealing with all of that. At the core of it, you have to have the anti-racist idea that there is nothing wrong with this group of which this man is a part of. That this man needs to be judged for who he is. And okay, your friend is worth buying that house, isn't he? He has the resources, and he has his ducks in the row, so to speak, doesn't he? And so we want to make it so that in this case, and in every case like it, that person can buy that house, irregardless of whatever barriers somebody else is putting there. That's what we have to do as anti-racist. But that's true in all cases. Where else is it that something is in place that we need to dismantle? And it's very invasive. Our president this year essentially said, I'm signing this into law so that all of you white people in the suburbs are protected from. There couldn't be a more blatant racism than that, could there? And yet he didn't see it at all as that. He saw it as protecting those that were in the suburbs, who just happened to be white. Right? And got applause because of that statement. And we need to call him on that. We need to call anybody on the places where that is what happens. Right? So as we go through these things, we have to remember to be very specific. That's why he uses the things policy, discrimination, and idea. Where is it that someone expresses an idea, or that there's some type of policy or law or that allows someone to view a person as lower than in whatever ways? Leticia.
The Community Reinvestment Act for the banking,
Yes.
has always been rife with very subtle racist overtones.
Absolutely.
And if you look at it right now, it says the federal government encourages the banks to reinvest. And back when they did it in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, rather than reinvest in minority areas, the banks just pulled out. And as long as they weren't within a 5-mile radius of any branch, they didn't have to participate and help those lower income and minority groups finance and get housing loans and that kind of stuff. I've been real hesitant to really look at national politics for a while. And those are the areas where we need to start sending letters and pushing at our senators to fix it. Just fix it, because that's what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a number of different ways that you can do that. There's a number of different levels. You just have to find where it is that you are going to somehow fight against the discrimination that is present around you. Now, here's where he makes a very strong point. Fighting present discrimination takes anti-racist discrimination. If we are going to do this, we have to say, in this case, in this moment, we have to figure out how to discriminate in a way that will help the person who has been discriminated against. And what much of your white power type of neighbors will say is, wait, but discrimination of any sort is wrong. And ultimately, I would agree with that once things are fixed. But if someone's at this level and another person is at this level, then this person needs discrimination to bring them up to an equal level. If they're at an equal level in whatever way, then you're right, discrimination is wrong. But until we equalize and bring people into that type of space, then we need that type of anti-racist discrimination. He goes on to say it this way: the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. Because we have to continually fix where it is that someone is being left out. 20 years ago, nobody wanted to look at the fact that gay and lesbians were being discriminated against. The work that's been done in those 20 years has taken away some of that discrimination, right? Who right now is being discriminated against in whatever way is what he's trying to talk about. How is it that presently there is still discrimination happening? So this is if you've watched, for example, the 13th movie, which is a marvelous film, Ava DuVernay makes the point that we fixed something in 1865 just to add a different way of being able to use that discrimination. So it needed to be fixed, and then something else needed to be fixed, and something else needed to be fixed. So even as we've moved forward, we've also continued to discriminate in a new way, partially because some people really want to have that discrimination there. And so those of us who want to be anti-racist have to be strong in making sure that we fight that. So how are you going to do it? Who do you need to see, and how do you need to step into a battle about discrimination? One of the reasons why I said yes to Francisco coming in and staying here at this church, which was a way of discriminating. Not every Hispanic got to stay in a church. There were a lot of other people, but I got to be able to be there present for him so that he and Sarai were safe. We got to be able to support him so that he could be in a safe space. Who are you going to help to get past that? So tell me about some of your successes that way. How is it that you have been able to help? And it could be small ways this week. It could be some ways in the past that you've done a really good job.
Since I moved back to Tucson 3 years ago, my focus has been, I live in the Mountain Fort Lowell area. There's a lot of homeless camps around here.
Where do you live again?
Mountain and Fort Lowell area.
Oh, that's close to me.
Lots of homeless around here. And so, and I was told by the police officers, the patrol, and the business owners not to talk to those people. I've been putting some of them to work when I can afford to. Others clothing them, and some others getting them off the street with the help of Catholic Social Services and Interfaith Community Services. And it's nice to have them come back a year later and thank me and tell me where they're at and how they're thriving.
Thank you. How about the rest of you? Where are you finding ways to do that?
Obviously, I have Richard living at my house, since June now. And like I say, he's the third asylum seeker that's African that I have opened my home to.
That's right. Go ahead, Laura.
When I was in Tucson, I was a literacy volunteer.
Perfect.
Embarrassed to say, I forgot. Is it called it wasn't Reading Seed, was it?
Yes, reading seed.
Yeah, it was Reading Seed, yeah.
Wonderful program. And I got to work with a woman who was about my age, who was from Mexico originally and had come to Tucson and struggled because she couldn't read. And
Literacy Connect.
yeah, Literacy Connect, right?
Yeah.
Yes, that's it, Laura. For
Yeah,
adults.
and anyway, that felt like I was really helping somebody who was just as smart as me, just as capable in every way, except she didn't have the resources that I had that allowed her to learn to read, and it was holding her back. And so that was a wonderful way to help in
Yeah.
that situation.
I think one of the most interesting things when it comes to Anglo-Hispanic issues is Anglos are really enamored of saying this: why don't they just learn English? And the question I would ask every single time that somebody says that is, why don't you start an ESL class so they can? Because every ESL class that I know of is full. And often in very white neighborhoods instead of in the neighborhoods where people who need to learn those, have that learning go on. So one thing that we could always do is start classes to be able to take care of whatever it is we see as the issue that's there. How are we empowering people to have the language that we say they don't have? How are we empowering someone who doesn't spend their money well to be able to spend it better? How are we giving people, how are we using our resources to give people the skills and resources that they need to be able to negotiate? The more we do something like, well, if they don't speak English, like I saw a story this week that said, if you speak Spanish in this store, then you owe me such and such an amount of money. How instead could I empower that to happen? Not force it to happen. Go ahead.
That language thought process you just gave them can in itself be racist.
It can be.
I was raised with Spanish, but I wasn't allowed to speak. I had to answer in English. So I don't speak well. I was an escrow officer. I had some clients that needed help with the education system after they bought, and they came to me for some advice. And we'd walk down the hall, and Mr. Camus would talk to me in Spanish, and I'd answer in English. And he'd respond in Spanish. And I remember my receptionist, after he left, he and his wife left, started laughing, and she goes, "You two walk down the hall like you understand each other." And I just had to smile. I said, "We do." So a lot of times that why can't they learn English? It's not just about English. It's assumption that they're not capable.
I know. That's exactly right. It's exactly right. And very often, for example, when I was teaching bilingual students, where those kids were making progress towards English, but came into my classroom very often having never spoken English before that. Their moms very often were not good English speakers. Why? Because they were always at home and in basically Hispanic neighborhoods where they had no opportunity to speak English. And so do we give them a space? Does the school give them a space so that they can learn English? Does the neighborhood set up ESL classes, right? What do we do for those people who are most unable to gain those things without us? Go ahead, Laura.
I know there's a distinction, but I'm struggling with it. And Judith brought this up earlier, this idea of assimilation as being a type of racism. And I clearly identified myself that if I had to call myself, what type of racist am I? I'm an assimilation, which my understanding is that you believe that there's nothing wrong with people of color. We just need to make them more like us. We just need to bring them up. And so when we're talking about teaching from other countries about English, I know there's a distinction, but it sets off these assimilationist thoughts that are
Yeah. So let's go to chapter 2, which is where they start talking about assimilationist, segregationist, and put it next to anti-racist. And tells the story about his parents, who, in his view, moved from anti-racist to assimilationist. Right? They said we have to fight how the Black community has become too criminal, right? And we have to move over to this. But then he made this point about most of white America. Our struggle is not usually between assimilationist and anti-racist. It's because our two choices have been typically assimilationist or segregationist. Now, how many know that segregationist is worse than assimilationist from your point of view? Me too, right? I see why that's wrong. So what his point is, I believe, is we've made the move from not being segregationist and think that we've finished the movement. That's good enough. I'm much better than them. And we may be right that we're better than them, but are we just making it so that there's another set of things that is wrong? So when I would teach my parents about English, I wasn't trying to do it in a way that said, lose your Spanish. In fact, I would tell my parents, you don't need to read to them in English, because most of my Spanish-speaking kids, their moms didn't read English. I said, you read to them in Spanish, because them hearing good language in Spanish will help them just as much as if they hear good language in English. I think that was me being an anti-racist, where an assimilationist would have said, only learning English is important, right? Because the reason I did that is because here's my experience. When I learned Spanish when I was 19 and 20 years old, and that's all I spoke for a couple of years, I came back from Argentina knowing more about English, even though I hadn't studied English at all during that time I was there. Why? Because knowing another language gives you insights into your own language. And so there's a saying in Spanish that el que habla dos, vale dos. The one who speaks two languages is worth two, right? The learning more gives you more, and you're a broader and a deeper person. And too often what our response has been for people is only learn what I think is of value. And that's an assimilationist point of view. And what true anti-racist is trying to say is there's stuff that is powerful about you that maybe I don't understand. So let me give you an example. How many have sometimes looked at the younger generation and wanted to say something like, pull up your pants? Right? What else might you say to that younger generation that doesn't make sense from whatever it is that you were taught was the right way of doing things? But what is it that they're doing with that? Why is that important to them? What is it that they are changing that maybe you don't understand, and maybe that's the point, that you're holding on to it because it worked for you, but it doesn't work for the future. Let me go to an observation that I've made. My mom and dad's generation was powerful at never getting divorces. Powerful about that. They rarely separated. Do you know why? The basic dynamic of why? My mom, who grew up in the midst of the Depression, grew up with a lot of of people around her where people were just abandoned. Because my grandparents' generation, much because of the depression, and somebody just left to go work and never came back, had extremely high rates of abandonment in marriages. And so as a response, her generation said, we are not going to leave each other no matter what, no matter how much of an no matter how bad you are, we're going to stay together. And so they stayed together sometimes at the expense of a family, right? And very often my generation grew up in families that should have been apart, in parents that should have separated so that the kids were in better spaces. So guess what my generation did? We split way too quickly because our parents never did. Our solution was that as soon as there's a problem, we're splitting. So you know what our kids did? They don't get married at all.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? They see the mess that my generation made of it and how we didn't honor it enough that they said, I'm not even starting down that road. Each generation has solved it, but in a way that the generation before them couldn't have. And how much are we doing that same type of thing? And do we give value to that younger generation to solve issues that we don't see? Do we give Black America the right to see and solve issues that white America doesn't see? And to react to America from the perspective that they have, not from what I wish they would have.
On the POC side of assimilation, I'm a second generation American, and it was really pushed on me, assimilate, assimilate, assimilate. The problem was I did everything right, but the racism was still there. And yeah, but and to the point where I was considered the top of my field in a company that I was working for, applied for management positions over and over again that I was fully qualified for, only to be told, but Letitia, you got to understand, you don't have the front office appearance we're looking for. And they were looking for young, skinny, blonde, blue-eyed women. That's what I would ask white America to look at.
What are the norms that we set up in our society and in ourselves that make it so that certain people can more easily advance, or certain people are more easily seen, or whatever it is, instead of fighting those problems? And so he talks a lot about the Reagan Revolution. And I loved what he said, that it was a radical revolution for the benefit of the already powerful. And yet most of us benefited to some degree from that revolution, but often at the expense of, right? The anti-immigration effort over the last 20 years and the law and order connected to that often was a benefit for white America, but at the expense of. And so we delegitimize and we keep salaries very low in areas where our Hispanic brothers and sisters are getting jobs, so that instead of legitimizing the work that we are benefiting from, for example, in Yuma, lettuce fields are almost all picked by people that are brown, and not just from the sun down in Yuma, right? They are people from Mexico that are picking your lettuce so that you have relatively cheap produce. And do you continue to benefit from that, or do we fight that? The drug culture of the that Reagan said he was fighting against, that just say no to drugs, was often a way to be able to hurt communities of color.
Absolutely.
And do we start fighting that?
That's been true since the 40s when they banned marijuana.
That's right. But see, I, as a white man in America, typically don't have to worry about that because they're not targeting me. But do I choose to because it is diminishing the us in some way or another?
I gotta tell you, anytime I hear a national, regional, or a local politician say, but we need those people, when they're in fact saying we need those people in the fields because we don't want to pay Americans their minimum wage to do this work for us, really irritates me.
Yeah.
And my concern, and you know this, with not making sure that people that come over, no matter how they come over, get legal representation, is that we're creating another set of Latinos in the shadows.
Yeah. Right. Right. And true anti-racism is about supporting policy that changes all of that. And the problem is this: it's way too easy for us to say, well, we're much better than those segregationists over there. Our convention was much better than their convention. Look at that. But is it strong enough? Is it truly turning us into the nation that we need to be? Or where is it that we're just taking a better than them, but not good enough position? So at one point, talking about the drugs, the Reagan Revolution against drugs. Did you read the thing that it said that white people are more likely than Black and Latinx people to sell drugs?
Sell drugs, yeah.
And the races consume drugs at similar rates. And yet people of color get longer sentences, are jailed for, are arrested and jailed for those sentences more often. We do not police ourselves with the ferocity that we police people of color.
That's for sure.
And yet we sell ourselves on the story that that's because we are okay, we've assimilated, and they're not.
That's also part of people of color's cry for justice. Not just that the people of color don't get unequitably prosecuted, that the whites that are committing the same crimes get prosecuted at the same rate.
Yeah, but it's not just that. At one point, one of the statistics you said that nonviolent Black drug offenders, okay, so they've broken a drug law. They're sentenced and they stay in prison for almost as long a time as violent white offenders.
For sure.
Okay. Drug use is not as bad as murder, and yet that's what it's saying, is that it's almost the same level that sentencing is happening. And we need to start saying that's not okay in our country.
Mm-hmm.
Do we still have the reefer madness depiction in our collective brain?
Say that
I
again.
can hardly understand you, Leticia.
Do we still have the reefer madness collective thought in our brains?
Yeah, there's no doubt that what happened in the 1930s, where we talked about reefer madness and all of that anti-drug stuff, continues to be the narrative that we live out of.
I think many of you know that I worked in different prison systems for a lot of my career, especially my last 8 years in Hawaii. I was the medical director of all the prisons and jails. And then when I moved to New Mexico, before I came back home to Tucson, I was medical director of that prison system for a year and a half or so as well. And I always said that I worked in a system I didn't believe in, that the majority, the vast majority belonged in residential drug treatment programs, not in prison or in jail, either one. And if and people really are ditzing the private prisons, but what we should ditz is our system, because if we were putting those people in residential drug treatment, which is what they need, then that's where the private system, we're a capitalistic country, then they'd be building drug rehab centers and not prisons. And so it's what we demand for need. We imprison people and then don't build enough prisons. So of course the capitalistic country, the private industry is going to do that. But if we put them in drug treatment centers, that's what those people would be building, and that our people would be doing better with that residential drug treatment.
That's exactly right, Kay. But that's a lot of what defund the police is saying. Okay, it is saying what is the right way to spend our money, what will most readily affect change that we want in this country. And the policing that we're doing, the automatic punishment, which from my perspective, I learned as a first grade teacher that punishment alone never changes anything. Right? That you have to add something else to it if you want to change it. It stops behavior, but we've made a heavy investment in just punishing as if that's going to change behavior. And we need to invest stuff in what will change behavior.
And actually the data is very clear for the prison systems all over the country. And I've read that data, that every educational program an inmate participates in decreases recidivism. Whether it's ESL classes, whether it's parenting skills, whether, any of those things, or anger management, or like I say, getting your ESL, I don't mean ESL, getting your GED. Hey, we were talking about ESL earlier, getting your GED or getting your AA degree. Every single class decreases recidivism. And yet when we cut our budgets to the prison systems, that's what we cut first, is all the educational programs.
That is because there's a certain amount of where it's very easy for us to believe if I just give him one more swat, then he'll change. Right? If I just punish one more time, then that will change. And a lot of what this is about going and seeing individuals and being in the life of individuals, right? And seeing how this person in front of me is being changed by either the good that is being added to that life or by the negative that is holding them back.
That's an interesting analogy, Tim, because a lot of times I've felt that my white brothers and sisters feel the need to instruct me. So what do we do with a little child? They go to touch the stove, swap their hands.
Yeah, I hope you don't hear, because good assimilationists are saying, I'm going to teach you in such a way that you become me. I hope that's not what you're hearing, Leticia. It's not that. I would say to my first graders, I would say to them, my Spanish speaking first graders, sometimes you might just have to learn some of these words in English because it will help you. But I didn't mean you need to learn English instead of Spanish.
Yeah, I understand that.
That's what we have to, on a regular basis, say. I'm not trying to take away something of who you are, but here's something that will aid you. But the problem is that it's really easy for us to go in, do an ESL class so that I can be the white savior. That's assimilationism playing out, and that's not what we want to do.
What I'm talking about is more like the LDS attitude that we need stewardship.
Yeah. Right. We need to help. We need to help empower people in the space where they're at. The hard part is that means that kind of like with your kids, when they turned 18 or 19, sometimes they make choices that you wouldn't make. But are we trusting of each other well enough to trust those choices? Does Black America have to make the same choices that I as white America make? Are my set of choices normative for our society? Should they be? The problem is it's easy for that to happen, isn't it? Because if my set of choices worked for me, then why wouldn't they work for you? But ultimately, that's not very trusting of that other person, whether it's because of race, because of gender, because of whatever. Do I choose to trust? The good news is, as he said towards the end of the chapter, said Black people have often expressed a desire to be American and have been encouraged in this by America's undeniable history of anti-racist progress, away from chattel slavery and Jim Crow. But then he goes on and says, Black people have also, as Du Bois said, desired to remain Negro, discouraged by America's undeniable history of racist progress, from advancing police violence and police suppression to widening racial inequities in areas ranging from health to wealth. And so we have this dual thing that we're sending out to each other that says two different messages. And it's that dueling consciousness that he says we have to get away from. That we have to choose to get free from all of that. And being anti-racist is the way to emancipate ourselves. So for the Black community, and it was very clear about this, for the Black community, they had to move from assimilation to anti-racism. That they sat in that space. They have to continue to be that. But we have to as well. Some of us from segregationists, I mean, we are caught between segregationists and assimilationists. Those have been our two options that as white America we've often given to each other. We have to move away from both of those and move towards saying, I choose to be anti-racist. But it's much simpler to say, I'm better than them. Because you may be, but it's ultimately not going to solve the issue to the extent of what we need to do. It's a lot of stuff, isn't it? Anybody got?
I hope we can continue the assimilation discussion more, because that still was, as somebody else said, was one of the most challenging words to me to try and, that probably, I think it was Laura, that's probably what I sort of believed, but the one who taught me to not accept that term was Tim Doherty in our project in Albany on our refugee resettlement project.
Yeah.
And that these are people mostly from Afghanistan, but assimilation, no, we want them to maintain who they are and their culture, but also succeed that they're now in the US. And that's, again, an incredible challenge.
It is.
But we don't necessarily want them to be just like us.
No, in fact,
that's
I would even
assimilation.
take it a step further. We want them to change us. We want who they are
to change us.
Right? We want something of who they are to make it so that the rest of us is better.
What strengths do their culture bring you?
Yeah, and usually in assimilation, what we really want is for you to become me. And that's.
So Jim,
yes.
you said it really well a little while ago, and it really clicked with me that, yeah, exactly. Assimilation is, you need to become more like me, whereas be an anti-racist or whatever term you want to use, is to say to that person, I don't want to take anything away from who you are. I just want to give you the things that will make it even better for you. Like if somebody comes to this country, there are clearly some skills
That's right.
that will help them to become, live a better life in this country, but to not take away what they brought with them. So that's, to me, a really good distinction.
That's right. And that's what that takes a lot of intentionality though. You have to be looking at things very open-eyed so that you see what is truly happening in this moment, not what your wide eyes want to see, if I can say it that way. You have
Jim,
to.
sometimes you don't always hear me when I talk about how I work with immigrants from Mexico, Central America, South America. I think most of you know that there is really no equivalent of the banking system
Yeah.
outside of the United States for the rest of the Americas south of here. And they don't trust the banks. So,
and they shouldn't trust the bank. When I was in Argentina, for example, and it's in some ways been a relatively stable economic place. Milk went from 200 not soles. Anyway, from 200 pesos, it wasn't pesos, but in 2 years, it went from that price to over 2,000. Okay, the cost went up tenfold over that amount of time. So literally, if you put your money in the bank, it would be worth less if you took it out a month later. And so you have to know that informs them in ways that they don't need to escape from. They need to let that continue to inform. Randy.
Thing that concerns me most, frightens me most, is the fact that it is against our interest to encourage the rest of the world to assimilate to our culture. And yet that is exactly the example we're holding out. My fear is that people will assimilate to our culture. The American culture, which is enjoyed by 4% of the world's population and consumes 45% of the world's resources. It's simply unsustainable.
Unsustainable. Yeah. But because it's so good for us, we want to say it's good for everybody, but you're right, at what expense? How quickly are we bringing about the end of the world if we only hold that up? And how open are we to being changed by some other ideas? Anyway,
Randy, the interesting thing about that is most of the immigrants coming to America don't consume at the rate that America does.
not at all. Not at all. You're muted, Randy.
Oh, it's all right. The concern I have is strangely is not the first immigrants, but their children,
Yeah.
who will grow up knowing nothing else. And it's frequently been said with no racial tie in at all that the most disastrous thing that can happen to the earth is the birth of an American male. It's,
Well, we've come to the end of our time. Luckily, we haven't come to the end of the book because you guys haven't solved it yet. If you will read chapters 2 and 3 for 3 and 4 for next week, we'll continue this discussion. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jim.
Bye-bye now.